The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the country club's terrace, crystal fragments catching the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. Royston Harwick didn't even glance down at the mess as his perfectly polished Italian leather shoes crunched over the shards. His eyes remained fixed on the dusty figure approaching across the manicured grounds, leading what appeared to be the most pathetic excuse for a horse he'd ever seen. "Good God," Royston muttered, his voice carrying the cultivated drawl of old money and newer arrogance. "What in the name of all that's holy is that creature supposed to be?" The other members of the Willowbrook Elite Racing Society gathered around him, their own expressions ranging from amused disdain to outright horror. The horse in question was a scraggly bay mare, her coat dulled by years of hard work and prairie dust. Her mane hung in tangled knots, and her ribs showed through skin that had seen too many harsh winters. She moved with the resigned gait of an animal that had given up on impressing anyone long ago. The man leading her was Cordell Weatherby, a third-generation rancher whose family had worked the same patch of unforgiving land for 60 years. His weathered hands gripped the frayed lead rope with the same gentle firmness he'd inherited from his grandfather, and his sun-beaten face remained impassive despite the snickers and whispered comments floating across the pristine lawn. "Harwick," Cordell nodded, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of a man who'd earned every callus on his hands. "Heard you were looking for competitors for your little race." Royston's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "Competitors, my dear fellow. I was looking for actual horses, not refugees from a glue factory." He gestured dramatically toward the stable behind him, where a dozen thoroughbreds worth more than most people's houses stood in climate-controlled stalls. "These are competitors. What you've brought is, well, I'm not entirely sure what you've brought." The mare, whose name was Dusty Rose though no one had bothered to ask, lifted her head slightly at the sound of laughter. Her dark eyes held a spark that seemed oddly out of place in her worn frame, like embers still glowing in what appeared to be cold ash. "She's got good lines," Cordell said quietly, running a hand along the mare's neck. Her great-grandsire was probably pulling a plow," Royston interrupted, his voice rising with theatrical disdain. "Really, Weatherby, I appreciate the rustic charm of your little hobby, but this is a serious racing competition. We're talking about horses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, trained by professionals, fed the finest oats money can buy, not some broken-down ranch horse who's never seen a proper track." The crowd of well-dressed spectators tittered their approval, their own expensive mounts shifting restlessly in the background. Royston's prize stallion, Midnight's Thunder, pranced in his stall as if sensing the attention, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the careful ministrations of his full-time groom. "I wouldn't want to embarrass you publicly," Royston continued, his tone dripping with false concern. "Perhaps you should take your pet home before someone calls animal control." Cordell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "The entry fee is $5,000, right? Winner takes all." "Indeed, but then we're entered." Cordell reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope, counting out 50 crisp $100 bills with the methodical precision of a man who'd worked for everyone. "Dusty Rose, and I will see you at the starting line come Saturday." The silence that followed was deafening. The news of the upcoming race spread through the small town of Millbrook like wildfire through summer grass. By Thursday morning, the barber shop was buzzing with speculation, the diner was taking bets with breakfast orders, and even the normally reserved librarian had been caught whispering about odds behind the biography section. Royston Harwick couldn't have been more pleased with the attention. He spent the week giving interviews to the local paper, posing for photographs with Midnight's Thunder, and holding court at the country club about the upcoming exhibition of his superior horsemanship. The race, he proclaimed to anyone who would listen, would serve as an excellent lesson in knowing one's place in the world. "It's really quite educational," he told the reporter from the Millbrook Gazette, adjusting his silk ascot as photographers snapped away. "The common folk need to understand that breeding, training, and proper investment are what separate true champions from barnyard animals. This Weatherby fellow will learn that hard work and wishful thinking can't compete with generations of superior bloodlines." Meanwhile, out at the Weatherby Ranch, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Cordell had risen before dawn every day that week, not to train Dusty Rose in any conventional sense, but to spend quiet time with her in the pasture where she'd lived most of her life. He'd brush her coat until it began to show hints of the rich bay color that had earned her name, and he'd talk to her in the low, steady voice that had calmed countless frightened animals over the years. "You don't owe me anything, girl," he'd murmur, working a particularly stubborn tangle from her mane. "But if you've got anything left in you, now might be the time to show it." The mare would stand perfectly still during these sessions, her ears pricked forward as if listening to every word. Sometimes she'd nuzzle his shoulder with a gentleness that belied her rough appearance, and Cordell would catch a glimpse of something in her eyes that made him remember why he'd never given up on her. The truth was, Dusty Rose had good bloodlines. Her great-grandsire had indeed been a champion, though not the kind Bryston would have recognized. He'd been a Mustang stallion, wild and free, who'd run across the plains with the wind in his mane and the sun on his back. That spirit had been passed down through generations of working horses, diluted perhaps by domestication and hard labor, but never completely extinguished. By Friday evening, the entire town had chosen sides. The wealthy summer residents and country club members had rallied behind Bryston, confident in their champion's inevitable victory. The working folks, the ranchers, farmers, shop owners, and laborers who formed the backbone of Millbrook had quietly begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, the underdog might have a chance. Old Gus Tremaine, who'd been shoeing horses for 40 years, stopped by the Weatherby Ranch that Friday night. He found Cordell in the stable, checking Dusty Rose's hooves one last time. "She's got good feet," Gus observed, running his gnarled hands along the mare's legs. "Strong bones. Not much meat on them, but strong." "She's tougher than she looks," Cordell replied. "That Harwick horse, he's fast," Gus continued, his weathered face thoughtful. "Seen him run. All flash and power, built for short bursts. Real impressive." Cordell nodded. He'd seen Midnight's Thunder too, had watched the stallions training runs from the fence line. The horse was everything Bryston claimed: fast, powerful, and perfectly conditioned. "But you know what I noticed?" Gus continued, a sly smile creeping across his features. "That fancy stallions never run more than a mile. Always short sprints, quick bursts. Never had to dig deep and find what's really inside." "The race is 2 miles, Cordell said quietly. 2 miles across rough ground," Gus corrected. 2 miles that'll test more than just speed. 2 miles that'll ask what a horse is really made of." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dusty Rose grazed peacefully in her pasture. Tomorrow would bring the race, and with it, the chance to prove that champions aren't always born in pristine stables or bred in immaculate bloodlines. Sometimes they emerge from the most unexpected places, carrying the heart of the wild wind in their souls. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes the world seem newly minted. By 8 o'clock, half the county had gathered at the makeshift starting line on the outskirts of town, where the old cattle trail began its winding 2-mile journey through prairie grass, creek beds, and rocky outcroppings before ending at the weathered oak tree that had marked the boundary of civilized land for over a century. Bryston Harwick arrived in style, his custom horse trailer gleaming like a mobile palace as it pulled into the designated area. Midnight's Thunder emerged from the trailer like a king greeting his subjects, his coat so perfectly groomed it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His muscles rippled beneath skin that had never known the sting of barbed wire or the bite of winter wind, and his eyes held the fierce intelligence of a predator bred for victory. The crowd parted respectfully as Bryston led his champion toward the starting line, his own attire a masterpiece of equestrian fashion. His riding boots gleamed with fresh polish, his jodhpurs were pressed to knife-sharp creases, and his silk shirt bore the monogram of his family's racing stable. He moved with the confident swagger of a man who'd never known defeat, acknowledging the admiring whispers with gracious nods and practiced smiles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, "prepare to witness a demonstration of what proper breeding and training can achieve. This will be educational for all of us." Dusty Rose and Cordell arrived on foot, having walked the 3 miles from the ranch in the cool morning air. The mare's coat had been brushed until it showed hints of its former glory, and her mane had been braided with simple competence rather than artistic flair. She looked around at the crowd with calm curiosity, her dark eyes taking in everything without apparent concern. Cordell wore his everyday clothes, worn jeans, a faded plaid shirt, and boots that had seen honest work. He carried no whip, no spurs, no elaborate equipment, just the same gentle hands that had been caring for horses since he was old enough to hold a brush. "Well, well," Bryston called out as they approached. "I was beginning to think you'd come to your senses and decided to spare yourself the humiliation." "Wouldn't miss it," Cordell replied evenly, running a hand along Dusty Rose's neck. The mare leaned into his touch, and for a moment, something passed between them, a communication deeper than words, older than civilization. Mayor Finnegan, a nervous little man who'd been pressed into service as the official starter, cleared his throat importantly. "Gentlemen, the rules are simple. 2 miles along the old cattle trail to the Boundary Oak and back. First horse and rider to cross the finish line wins the purse of $10,000. Bryston swung into his custom saddle with practiced ease, his movements fluid and confident. Midnight's thunder pranced beneath him, eager for the race to begin. The stallion's nostrils flared as he scented the morning air, and his muscles bunched with barely contained energy. Cordell approached Dusty Rose more quietly, speaking to her in words too low for the crowd to hear. When he mounted, it was with the economical grace of a man who'd been riding since childhood. The mare stood perfectly still, her ears pricked forward toward the trail ahead. "On your mark," Mayor Finnegan called, raising his starting pistol. The crowd fell silent, the only sounds the soft snorting of the horses and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. "Get set," Midnight's thunder pawed the ground, his entire body coiled like a spring. Dusty Rose remained motionless, but something in her stance had changed. Her head was higher now, her eyes focused on the distant trail with laser intensity. "Go." The pistol cracked, and Midnight's thunder exploded from the starting line like a bolt of black lightning. His hooves thundered against the packed earth as he stretched into a full gallop, his powerful stride eating up the ground with mechanical precision. The crowd roared its approval as horse and rider pulled away from the line, Bryston's triumphant laughter carrying back on the wind. Dusty Rose started more quietly, but with no less determination. Where Midnight's thunder had burst forward with explosive power, she began with the steady, measured pace of a horse who understood that the race was not won in the first 100 yards, but in the last. As the two horses disappeared into the morning haze, the crowd settled into wait, some confident in the outcome, others beginning to hope for a miracle. The first mile of the cattle trail was deceptive in its simplicity. What appeared to be level ground from a distance revealed itself as a series of subtle rises and dips, each one designed by nature to test the legs and lungs of any creature foolish enough to challenge the prairie at speed. Sagebrush and prairie grass created a natural obstacle course, while hidden gopher holes waited to trap the unwary hoof. Midnight's thunder maintained his blistering pace through the first quarter mile, his hooves striking the earth with the rhythm of a perfectly tuned machine. Bryston sat his saddle with the relaxed confidence of a man who'd never doubted the outcome, occasionally glancing back to see how far behind his competitor had fallen. What he saw brought a satisfied smile to his lips. Dusty Rose was indeed behind, but not by as much as he'd expected. The mare had settled into a steady lope that seemed almost casual compared to his stallion's dramatic gallop, but she was covering ground with surprising efficiency. Her stride was longer than it appeared, and she moved with the kind of fluid grace that comes from years of navigating rough terrain. "Come on, Thunder," Bryston called to his mount, applying a touch of spur to maintain their pace. "Let's show these country folk what real speed looks like." But as they approached the halfway point of the outbound leg, subtle changes began to manifest. Midnight's Thunder's breathing, while still strong, was becoming more labored. His perfect stride developed the slightest irregularity, and his head began to rise as he fought to maintain his oxygen intake. The stallion was running exactly as he'd been trained to run, fast, powerful, and without reservation. The problem was, he'd never been asked to run this far at this pace. Behind them, Dusty Rose was beginning to find her rhythm. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, and her stride, rather than shortening with fatigue, seemed to lengthen with each passing minute. This was the pace she'd learned running free in the pasture, the sustainable speed that allowed her to cover vast distances without exhaustion. Where Midnight's Thunder was burning his fuel like a race car, Dusty Rose was conserving hers like a cross-country runner. The first real test came at Willow Creek, a narrow but fast-flowing stream that cut across the trail like a natural barrier. Midnight's Thunder reached it first, his hooves splashing into the water with impressive force. But the rocky bottom and swift current required different skills than the carefully maintained tracks he was accustomed to. He stumbled slightly, recovered, then had to pause to find his footing on the far bank. Dusty Rose approached the creek with the confidence of a horse who'd crossed 1,000 such streams. She entered the water without hesitation, her sure feet finding purchase on the submerged rocks as if she'd mapped their location years ago. In 3 smooth bounds, she was across and climbing the opposite bank, her pace never faltering. The gap between them had closed to less than 50 yards. Bryston felt the first flutter of concern in his chest as he urged Midnight's Thunder back to full speed. The stallion responded gamely, but his breathing was becoming increasingly strained. Sweat darkened his perfect coat, and his ears, which had been pricked forward with eagerness at the start, now lay back against his head in a way that spoke of growing fatigue. "Just a little farther, boy," Bryston murmured, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "We reached the oak tree, then it's downhill all the way home." The boundary oak loomed ahead, its massive trunk scarred by a century of weather and time. It had stood sentinel over this land when the first settlers arrived, had watched the cattle drives and the coming of the railroad, had survived drought and flood, and the endless cycle of seasons. Now it waited to witness another small drama in the long history of the prairie. Midnight's Thunder reached the oak first, but his lead had shrunk to mere lengths. As Bryston wheeled his mount around the tree for the return journey, he caught a glimpse of Dusty Rose's eyes, and what he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. There was no fatigue in those dark depths, no strain or exhaustion. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like anticipation, as if the real race was just beginning. As they rounded the oak and began the long journey home, Dusty Rose was running with the wind in her mane and the spirit of her wild ancestors singing in her blood. Behind her, generations of Mustangs who had run free across these same plains seemed to whisper their encouragement, reminding her that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who refuse to quit. The real race was just beginning. The second mile began with a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between the two horses. Where Midnight's Thunder had dominated the first half of the race, with his explosive speed and perfect form, the return journey revealed the difference between a sprinter pushed beyond his limits and a true distance runner finally hitting her stride. Bryston could feel the change in his mount's movement before he could see it. Midnight's Thunder's breathing had become ragged, his stride shorter and less fluid. The stallion's head was high now, fighting for air, and his powerful hindquarters were beginning to show the strain of maintaining a pace that was simply unsustainable for the distance. Sweat foam flecked his neck and shoulders, and his eyes, which had blazed with competitive fire at the start, now held a hint of confusion as his body began to betray his will. "Come on, Thunder," Bryston urged, his voice tight with growing desperation. "We're almost there. Just hold on." But even as he spoke the words, he could hear the sound that every horseman dreads, the labored breathing of a horse pushed beyond its capacity. Midnight's Thunder was giving everything he had, but everything he had was no longer enough. Behind them, Dusty Rose was beginning to reveal her true nature. The mare who had looked so pathetic in the paddock, so worn and ordinary compared to the gleaming champion ahead of her, was transforming before the eyes of anyone close enough to see. Her stride was lengthening with each passing minute. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, and her dark eyes held the fierce joy of a creature finally allowed to express its deepest truth. This was what she had been bred for, though not in the way Bryston understood breeding. Where Midnight's Thunder carried the legacy of careful genetic selection for speed and power, Dusty Rose carried something far more precious: the accumulated wisdom of generations of horses who had survived on the open range, who had learned to run not for sport or prize money, but for the pure necessity of staying alive in a world that offered no second chances. "Easy, girl," Cordell murmured to Dusty Rose, his voice carrying the calm confidence of a man who had finally seen what he'd always believed was there. "Easy does it. We've got all day." But the mare was beyond need of encouragement now. She was running with the memory of her ancestors, with the genetic programming of countless generations, who had learned that the race is not always to the swift, but to those who endure. Her hooves seemed to barely touch the ground, and her breath came in the steady rhythm of a creature perfectly adapted to the task at hand. The creek crossing on the return journey told the story in stark detail. Midnight's Thunder approached the water at a stumbling trot, his magnificent head hanging low as he fought for breath. He entered the stream cautiously, his legs trembling with fatigue, and nearly fell when his hoof slipped on a moss-covered rock. Royston had to grab the saddle horn to keep his seat, his face pale with the realization that his sure victory was slipping away like water through his fingers. Dusty Rose hit the creek at full stride, her sure feet finding purchase on the rocky bottom with the precision of a mountain goat. She bounded across in 3 fluid leaps, water streaming from her legs like liquid silver, and emerged on the far bank with her pace unchanged. As she passed Midnight's Thunder in the middle of the stream, she turned her head slightly, and for just a moment, her eyes met those of the struggling stallion. There was no malice in that look, no triumph or mockery. Instead, there was something that might have been understanding, acknowledgement that both horses were doing what they had been born to do, and that the fault lay not in their effort, but in the assumptions of those who had underestimated what it truly means to be a champion. The final half-mile stretched ahead like a test of everything that mattered. Midnight's Thunder gamely tried to match Dusty Rose's pace, his breeding and training demanding that he give everything he had. But his everything was no longer enough. His stride faltered, his breathing became labored to the point of distress, and finally, with a wisdom that spoke to his essential nobility, he slowed to a walk. Royston sat in his saddle, his expensive riding clothes now stained with sweat and dust, his face a mask of disbelief. The impossible was happening before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His champion, his expensive, perfectly bred thoroughbred, was beaten by a horse he'd dismissed as a glue factory refugee. The crowd at the finish line could hear them coming long before they appeared over the rise. First came the steady drumbeat of hooves at full gallop, then the ragged breathing of a horse pushed beyond its limits. When they finally came into view, a great cheer rose from the assembled townspeople, not because they were seeing the expected outcome, but because they were witnessing something they had never dared to hope for. The underdog was winning. The roar of the crowd grew louder as Dusty Rose crested the final hill, her stride still strong and her head held high. What had begun as a race to humiliate an upstart rancher had become something far more significant, a testament to the power of heart over pedigree, of substance over style, of the quiet dignity that comes from a life honestly lived. Cordell could see the finish line ahead, marked by the same weathered posts that had served the town for generations. The crowd was on its feet now, a mixture of summer residents and local folks united in their amazement at what they were witnessing. Children who had climbed trees for a better view pointed and shouted, while their parents stood in stunned silence, watching their assumptions about winners and losers crumble before their eyes. Dusty Rose crossed the finish line at a full gallop, her mane streaming behind her like a banner of victory. She could have run another mile, could have gone on until the sun set and the stars came out, because she was finally doing what she had been born to do. The crowd erupted in cheers, hats flying into the air, and even some of the country club members found themselves applauding despite their shock. Cordell slowed his mount to a gentle lope, then a walk, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile many had seen from him in years. He dismounted and immediately went to Dusty Rose, checking her breathing and running his hands along her legs with the practiced care of a man who valued his animals above all else. The mare was breathing hard but steadily, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Well, I'll be damned," old Gus Tremaine whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. She did it. The old girl actually did it. It was another 5 minutes before Midnight's Thunder appeared on the horizon. moving at a weary walk with Bryston slumped in the saddle. The stallion's head hung low, his magnificent coat darkened with sweat and foam. His breathing labored and distressed. There was no shame in his defeat. He had run his heart out, had given everything he had to give. The fault lay not with the horse, but with those who had failed to understand that breeding and training mean nothing without the will to endure. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Bryston dismounted and began to tend to his horse. Whatever his faults, he was horseman enough to put his animal's welfare first. He loosened the girth, checked for injuries, and spoke quietly to the exhausted stallion. Only when he was satisfied that Midnight's Thunder was not seriously hurt did he turn to face the crowd. His face was a study in conflicting emotions: embarrassment, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. He walked slowly toward Cordell, his expensive boots scuffing in the dust, his perfect posture finally broken by the weight of a lesson he'd never expected to learn. He began, then stopped, searching for words that had never been needed before. I underestimated your horse, and you. Cordell nodded, his hand still resting on Dusty Rose's neck. She's got good heart, always has, just needed the chance to show it. The money, Bryston said, quietly, reaching into his jacket. $10,000, it's yours. Keep it, Cordell said, surprising everyone within earshot. Put it toward taking better care of your horse. He's got good heart too, just needs to learn his limits. The crowd murmured its approval, but Cordell wasn't finished. There's something else. That development project you've been pushing, the one that would pave over the old cattle trail. The town council voted it down yesterday. Seems folks think some things are worth preserving. Bryston's eyebrows rose. The council voted, but I thought. People change their minds, Mayor Finnegan interjected, stepping forward with a nervous smile. Sometimes they need to be reminded of what's really important. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate Cordell and get a closer look at the unlikely champion, Bryston found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time in years. He'd come to this small town expecting to demonstrate his superiority, to put the locals in their place with a display of wealth and breeding. Instead, he'd learned something about the difference between having everything and being everything. Dusty Rose stood quietly beside the old oak tree, her breathing normal now, her eyes holding the same calm intelligence they'd always possessed. Children approached cautiously, their parents' permissions granted with reluctant smiles, and she allowed them to pet her neck and feed her handfuls of grass. She was, once again, just a horse, but a horse who had proven that championships aren't always won by the fastest or the strongest, but by those who refuse to quit when the going gets tough. Cordell loaded his mare into the old trailer he'd borrowed for the occasion, the $10,000 in prize money tucked safely in his pocket despite his earlier gesture. The town council had quietly insisted he keep it, recognizing that his victory had been about more than just a horse race. It had been about dignity, about the value of honest work, about the truth that worth isn't measured in dollars or bloodlines, but in the courage to keep going when everyone else has counted you out. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dusty Rose grazed peacefully in her familiar pasture. She was home, surrounded by the land she loved, her moment of glory already fading into memory. But something had changed in the way she carried herself, in the set of her head and the spring in her step. She had been seen, truly seen, for what she was: not just a horse, but a champion. And in the quiet of the evening, with the wind whispering through the grass and the stars beginning to appear overhead, that was enough.